Hi guys, welcome back to Too Cool for Middle School. I've had a couple requests to talk about my master's journey, just getting my master's while I was also teaching. And so the only reason I kind of hesitated to do it was because I probably have kind of like a unique way that I went about it, and not a lot of people are probably going to do it the way that I did. But maybe that's just how everyone feels. I don't know. And quite a few people have asked me to just talk about how I did it. Sometimes it's just nice to like hear someone else's struggle. Like I remember actually going through my master's and Googling, or like on YouTube, you know, like searching like other people's master's journeys, because I just wanted to hear other people talk about it. It's a pretty lonely process, at least it was for me, because in the end I was just writing my thesis by myself, and that was what took the longest, and it's a pretty solitary thing. So this is just for anybody out there that is working on their master's or thinking about working on their master's, or for some reason thinking back to their master's and wanting to relive it. So I have my master's degree in history because I love history, and even though I'm a teacher, I hate education classes. I just really hated them, and it would just like, I would be dead inside if I had to get a master's in education. I'm sure I would have learned a lot of good stuff, but I care more about content. I just wanted to learn more about history. So I live in California, so I got my bachelor's degree, and then you have to go back and get a credential, which is separate from your bachelor's degree. Like I'm pretty sure in California there are no education degrees. Like you can't major in education. You would just major in like liberal studies if you wanted to be an elementary teacher, and then you would major in like math or history if you wanted to be a secondary teacher. And I have a whole nother video about getting your credential in California that I can link below. But so I went back and got my credential, and then I've told this story a few times too. Like when I got out of my credential program, there were just no jobs. There was a budget crisis. There were a ton of layoffs. And so I wasn't able to get a teaching job that first year out, and I just ran after school programs, which was really good experience actually. But after a few months, I was just like, as long as I have time on my hands, because that was only a part-time job, I was like, I need to be like furthering my education. So I applied to the same school that I got my credential at, Cal State Fullerton. Like we lived kind of near there, and I knew the campus and all that, so I figured that would be the best place to go. And they had a really, really great history program. One of my professors told me that their graduate history program is second in the nation to Harvard. So I don't know why he would lie about that. It seems a little bit far-fetched, but I think it was true. So anyway, I applied to do that, and you have to like in your essay like write about what you want to study. And initially I wanted to study Native American education, like the history of Native American education. Maybe I could shed some light on the history of like education as an oppressive force and like a traumatic force in most Native American tribes, and like the process of like kind of trying to undo that. So anyway, that's what I went into it wanting to study, and that's kind of what I studied in the beginning. And I had to take oh gosh, I remember I took this constitutional law class. That was my hardest class I think I ever took in my master's program, was the history of constitutional law. I had Dr. Bakken, who is like this legendary professor at Cal State Fullerton. Rest in peace, Dr. Bakken. We all miss you. You impacted all of us. He pushed us so hard. I think we had to read 24 books that semester, and he wrote most of them, so there was no way to like pretend like you read it. And so my history program was all in person. There was no online option. That's another thing. So by the time I finished my master's degree, that was 12 years of college altogether. And somewhere around year 10, the government cut me off from student loans, because I used student loans to finance my own college completely by myself. I paid for all my own school, all my own housing, my own car, my own food, my own everything, which ended up being very, very expensive. I am like drowning in student loan debt now, so I need to take care of that, but we kind of all are. And I mean, that's one of the things about becoming a teacher, is that it's very, very expensive. Most of the time they prefer that you have a master's degree. Like you really need to probably get your master's pretty soon after you get hired, plus you know you need a credential and a degree, and that's just it's getting very, very expensive to do. So anyway, that's a whole nother thing that I don't have figured out. And I know there are like financial programs, like forgiveness programs for loans for teachers who work in certain areas. And I used to work in areas that would count, and now I do not. So I don't qualify for those loan repayment programs. So, okay, so anyway, I had to go to campus in order to go to class. It was semesters, so you know, it's like what, like 16 weeks or something. At the beginning, since I was working at after school programs, I took classes in the morning. I would usually take 2 classes at a time, so like 6 units at a time, which was part-time. And then once I did get a teaching job, I started taking night classes. So I would usually do a class from like 4 to 7 and then 7 to 10. And so that was really tiring, so I'd have to, you know, drive all the way back home and then be ready for work the next morning. And it was a lot of reading. History classes have the most reading and the most writing of like any department ever. It was very typical for there to be a book a week per class that you were taking, and then a lot of times you'd have to write like a précis on every book that you read, and so that's like a 2-page kind of summary of like the main arguments and the methodology and the historical lens and all that kind of stuff. So by doing so much reading and so much writing, like you really just kind of get into a groove. And I was in that groove for like 5 years straight, where you really can get everything read. You can read quickly because you know what you're looking for and you know what you're going to need to remember and like what you can kind of skim over. At the beginning of my program, I feel like I had to write a lot of 10-page papers, which is like, I can do like that now because just the process is really easy. Like you just get used to that length and like the amount of research you need to do and the amount of sources that you need to have. So that was fairly easy, but then you started moving on to like having like usually a 30-page paper. That was pretty typical of a lot of the 500 level classes. And I remember taking like my first theory class, like that was one of the first classes you're supposed to take in the program. And we had to do a historiography of whatever we were kind of planning on writing our thesis on. And so I will do a whole video about my thesis because I love it. I love talking about my thesis to anybody who will listen. So I'll totally make like a separate video just on my research and my master's thesis. But I ended up doing it on my husband's great-grandfather, who was an amazing civil rights leader in the US Virgin Islands. And I didn't know anything about him. Derek didn't even really know anything about him, but his stepmom actually told me about him one time, and I was like, what? Who is this guy? And apparently he's really famous in the Virgin Islands, but most people have never heard of him. So I did some research on him just for that one paper, just to do a historiography, which is like a history of the history of something or somewhere. And I just became fascinated. And now I love studying like US territories during the age of imperialism, because one of the things that I loved studying about Native American history, which I took a lot of classes in the beginning, is the way that it forced the United States government to like define itself. Because, you know, they'd have all these rules about like, okay, well, this is sovereignty or this is citizenship. And then they would come up against something that the Native Americans were doing and they'd be like, okay, no, actually it's this. Oh, wait, no, actually it's this. And these kind of like anomalies, like Native American tribes or US territories, force the United States, or just, you know, anomalies in general, force like the hegemony to define their terms, and usually they expose a lot of hypocrisy. And so to me, that's just really fascinating. So it was an easy switch to go from studying Native American history into studying like island history and territories. And I was just so intrigued and propelled by my interest in the history of the Virgin Islands and the history of Rothschild Francis. And then it actually ended up overlapping with the history of the Harlem Renaissance, because he would come to New York a lot to like raise money and raise support for his causes in the Virgin Islands. And actually most of the political leaders during the Harlem Renaissance were from Caribbean countries, and I can go into all of that like when I make my video about my thesis, but all of it was just so fascinating that I was so motivated to really put a lot into my thesis that it wasn't like drudgery for me. And most of the papers that you get to write in your master's classes like are up to you, you know, like I could just do further research into the Virgin Islands for like almost every class. So all these books up here are like books that I collected about the Virgin Islands. I was just like at multiple libraries all the time. I would bring a duffel bag full of books. And this was before I had Jensen, of course. So my weekends were just me going to the library, because a lot of this time too we lived in like these little teeny tiny apartments where I did not have a desk. Like we moved here for this desk so that I could finish my thesis. I was like, I can't drive to the library every single weekend, like forever. I need to be able to do some at home, but I would still end up going to the library a lot because I could just sit in one of those little cubicles, bring some goldfish crackers, you know, a water bottle, and just sit there for hours and just try and piece together this evidence that I had, these quotes from Rothschild Francis, like try and fit it into bigger themes about imperialism, or make comparisons between him and other political leaders in the Harlem Renaissance, and study like Caribbean radicalism. There was one professor in particular that I worked with most closely, and he was a professor of the Caribbean and Cuba and like Latin America in general, so he didn't really know a ton about the Virgin Islands, but he was like the closest to my project, so it was really fun to work with him. He was an awesome professor, and I was in his office hours all the time, and then I had to have a few other people on my committee. It's just such a good discipline to take history classes. You just learn to think so well and like read so well and write so well. And for most of my history classes, you would just like read a book over the week, and you just usually have class once a week, and it would be 3 hours. And for the most part, like you sit in a circle and just discuss the book and like, you know, make arguments about the book, and then you have to defend those arguments with evidence. And it's just, like, to me, that's really fun. It's not like arguing like you're mad at each other, but just, you know, pulling out different arguments or like critiques of the book, and it's really fun to me. And that's one of the reasons why I value history so much, is because it just makes you such a good critical thinker. It prepares you for a lot of different jobs because of the way that you work with sources and you work with documents, and you go out and you know, learn to just be a really good researcher, a really efficient reader, a really concise writer, and it usually improves your speaking skills as well. So it was just, it was such a fun time for me. I do kind of miss you know, being in class, and I just miss like being on a college campus and stuff. So I think a lot of people do once they're done. Like, you're glad that you don't have to do homework every single weekend anymore, but you kind of like miss just like the stimulation of class. And I had wonderful professors. They were great. So I could see how, you know, maybe Cal State Fullerton is one of the best in the nation. So I finished my thesis and graduated, you know, walked and got my diploma a week before I had Jensen. So I did all of like the end of my thesis while I was pregnant, and then I was huge when I graduated. Thank goodness those gowns are roomy. So yeah, it was like perfect timing. It just kind of all aligned for me. And right after I was done with my thesis, then I just had a baby and moved on to a totally new stage in life. I'm really glad that I don't have to do any classes, you know, with a baby. Like, those of you who go to school and have kids, I am so amazed by you. I feel like whenever there were moms in my classes, they always like were the best. Like, they had like the highest grades, like had things done on time. I think just because being a mom like makes you really efficient, but I don't know about for me, like I feel like I would not do as well. I pulled multiple all-nighters. I remember like while like my sixth graders were working on a final, I was also like at my desk like working on a final, and I was like writing a paper that was like 25 pages or something, and my students were like, how long have you known about this deadline? You should have had it done earlier. I'm like, I know, be quiet. And I had been up all night long, and I was like halfway falling asleep while working on the paper. They're like, come on, Mrs. Forbes, you can do it. You can do it. I got a lot of things in like right before the deadline. So I mean, it's tough to do it while you're also working. But for me, like all the stars kind of aligned. Like, the raise that I got because of my master's and moving into a different district that like paid a little bit more because of a master's, that allowed me to pay for daycare, you know, after Jensen was born and I went back to work. So it was nice that I got this big raise, but all of it and more goes into daycare. So, you know, but otherwise I don't know what we would have done. So for me, it was worth it to get that master's, get the raise, and it's just gonna be, you know, something that helps me help my family. And then plus, and I can talk about this in a little bit more detail when I just talk about my thesis in general, but I learned so much about my husband's family history, and that is just priceless to me. And Rothschild Francis is one of my all-time heroes. He is incredible. He's so inspiring to me, and I want Jensen to grow up knowing about him and knowing what he did for the people of the Virgin Islands and for all Americans. So I think the takeaway really is just do whatever you're passionate about. If you really are passionate about education and there's like a certain aspect, maybe like restorative practices or reading or literacy or like whatever little niche that you have in education, do that, because your motivation to, you know, follow your passion is going to be what pushes you through. If you're not doing something that you love, then it's going to be a little bit harder and it's going to feel like really long and really difficult. But you know, if you love science, get a master's in science. Just do whatever it is that is going to propel you forward and make you want to learn, and then things that you can use in your class. And now for me, this has opened a few doors, because I could potentially like teach history at a junior college, or maybe work in like a credential program one day teaching like pedagogy classes for history or something like that. You know, I just have a specialty, and so like US history in particular is my specialty. And the biggest thing is it just gave me those skills that I talked about that studying history gives you. And even just as a citizen of the world, I feel like it's a really great skill that I can you know, read articles or like consume news with a more critical eye, and to me that's just important. So I hope that this was helpful for you. If you have a master's, or you're thinking about going back and getting your master's, write down below what your like specialty was, like history or science or literacy or whatever. Write down below just what your passion was that you wanted to study further. Hi guys, I'm back. As I was editing, I realized that I left out a couple of important things that I just wanted to get in real quick. So first of all, I just wanted to go a little bit more in depth into the research process and traveling for research. So first of all, for library research, I usually used the search engine WorldCat. That was usually my kind of go-to search engine. And then if you go to, I think this is at like every college, I'm pretty sure, but you can use interlibrary loan. So even if your library doesn't have something, and ours really didn't have a lot of the things that I needed, you can borrow it for free through interlibrary loan or Iliad. So make sure that you're taking advantage of that service through your school library. And then there were some things though that were at certain libraries, but they weren't allowed to be checked out. So there were a couple of newspapers from Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance that Cal State Dominguez Hills had in their library, but I wasn't able to leave the library with it. So I just went there a couple of times and either like made copies of those things, or took pictures of pages, or just kind of took notes on what I was interested in. And then also UC Irvine just had a much wider selection of books on the Harlem Renaissance than did Cal State Fullerton. And the only thing about those search engines is that it just doesn't really compare to, you know, like finding that call number and going into the stacks, and you're looking for, you know, whatever specific book you had on your list, but then as you're looking, you see all these other books that for whatever reason didn't come up in your keyword search. And sometimes that's where you find some of your best sources, is just while you're looking for something else. So that's why I kind of spread out my research between 3 different universities. And then the other thing that I had to do was travel for research. And if you are a historian, to do your master's, you're probably going to need to travel somewhere. And this is one of the reasons that some people, you know, choose Paris for their topic of research, and they're like, oh no, I guess I have to travel to Paris and go look through their archives. And that's kind of the same for me. You know, I had the Virgin Islands, like, oh, I guess I'm gonna have to go sit on a beach and look through these sources. But for me, that was cost prohibitive. My husband and I have been trying to get to the Virgin Islands for 7 years. Since we've been married, we wanted to go there for our honeymoon, and it's just expensive to like get to Florida, but then from Florida to the Virgin Islands is actually fairly affordable. But yeah, one of these days we're gonna get there, but it just wasn't doable for me. But the other thing about, you know, territories or colonies, or, you know, some of these islands that are controlled by other countries, is a lot of their historical documentation is housed elsewhere in other archives, and it's usually housed by, you know, the colonizing country. So in Washington DC, they actually had a lot of documents that I needed to access, and in New York at the Schoenberg Center for Black History, they also have a bunch of documents and sources. I just kind of had to choose between the two because I couldn't really afford to go both. I wish that I had gotten to go to New York. Like, that would be my dream. At this point, after going to the Virgin Islands, I would love to go to New York, especially since so many Caribbean people migrated to New York, and so that's why they have a lot of like Caribbean history in New York, and that's where my father-in-law's family all moved and everything, so that would be really cool to see. And actually, Rothschild Francis himself was exiled to New York eventually, but I decided to go to Washington, D.C. I went to the Library of Congress over my spring break, 2 spring breaks ago. One of my really good friends, actually, her husband worked for the Obama administration, so they moved out to Washington, D.C. So I was able to stay with her, and that kind of cut down on my costs a little bit, and she was able to kind of show me around. We got to do some sightseeing, but during the day, I just locked myself in the Library of Congress, which was amazing. It was such an amazing opportunity to get to go do research there. So Rothschild Francis actually wrote his own newspaper. He was the editor of his own newspaper called The Emancipator. And at the Library of Congress and in New York, they have the actual newspapers from like 1923. They're delicate and they're faded, and just getting to see those and hold them in my hands was like, oh my goodness, it was incredible. So if you are going to travel a long way to do some research and go to a library, contact the librarian before you go. So about 2 months before I went to Washington, D.C., I started emailing one of the librarians at the Library of Congress, and she was able to pull the things that I needed, which I had found on WorldCat, but it just, said it's at the Library of Congress and you have to go there to get it. So she was able to pull a few things for me, and then like she knew who I was when I came in, and they had this machine that would take pictures of whatever pages you wanted, like without damaging them. So it's kind of like a copy machine, but you would just like lay it out and like push a button and it took a picture from above. So I just took pictures of every single page of every single edition of the newspaper that they had. So that was really time intensive and labor intensive. They also had a lot of things on like microfiche, which is also kind of labor intensive. So even though, it was like spring break and I wanted to hang out with my friend, it was mostly just hours and hours of being in the library and getting the documentation that I needed, because once I left, I wasn't gonna be able to go back and get any more sources. Let me see if I have some of this stuff. Oh, let's see. Yeah. Basically everything in this cabinet is copies from the Library of Congress. Okay, I just thought I would get some things out and show you. I have like a whole entire binder of all of the Emancipator articles, and then they're also all on a flash drive. I like saved everything on a flash drive, put it into files, emailed it to myself, just made sure that I was not going to lose that very, very valuable information. I went to like FedEx or whatever, and I just made little like portfolios of the kind of different topics that I had done research on. So these were the things that I had found on microfiche actually. These are all ACLU files on the US Virgin Islands. One of the ACLU's very first projects was working with Rothschild Francis. And so, I just took copies off of the microfiche files and just eventually printed them out and put them into this book. A lot of them have this little mark on them. I'm not actually sure what that means. So like, what is this? Vote is urged for Virgin Isles. This says Danish West Indies persecuted since U.S. purchase. Says Francis. Okay, so yay! Oh yeah, cool. Okay, although the treaty signed with Denmark 5 years ago stressed the fact that the natives of the Virgin Islands were to have a civil government as soon as possible, the United States has taken no steps to procure it for them. Rothschild Francis, member of the Colonial Council there, said at a protest meeting declaring for civil rights for the islands held at St. Mark's Hall, 67 West 138th Street yesterday afternoon. Yee, cool. Okay, this is all about Rothschild Francis, and this is in New York. He went there a lot to gain support for his cause. So when you find stuff like that, it's just absolutely amazing. There's not even really a way to describe it, but if you are a historian and you find this source that nobody else has that fits into your research perfectly, that is a feeling like no other. I think I'm gonna go through and look at all this stuff again. It's just so cool. But yes, anyway, traveling for research is probably something that you will have to do if you are doing a graduate degree in history and you're writing a thesis, as opposed to like taking a comp exam or whatever. Just found one other really cool thing. This was one of the only pictures of him that I found. This was a centennial symposium on Rothschild Francis in 1991 to commemorate the year of his birth, 1891, and he died in 1963. So this is like one of the only pictures that exists of him. If there were more, I would know about them. There are like 5 and I have them all, and I have this thing like marked up to high heaven. So I use this quite a bit in my thesis. So this was exciting to find. So anyway, thank you again for sticking around for like part 2 here and talking about research. I've actually noticed some comments lately from other people who did graduate work in history, and it's really cool to find you guys. I notice your comments. I love finding you and hearing from you. We are a rare breed. My battery's gonna die, so go learn something about history today. Love you. See you in my next video. Bye.